Our speaker now will be Alex Belser. Alexander is a clinical research fellow at Yale University. He was a founding member of the Psychedelic Research Group at New York University, and there he conducted a qualitative study exploring how cancer patients experience psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. Now he collaborates in an investigation of psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy as a treatment for alcohol addiction. As a clinician, he's part of the psychotherapy team treating patients in the phase 3 trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. In his talk today, he will be speaking about the psychedelic mystical experience. Please give a warm welcome to Alex Belser.
Hi, everybody. How are we holding up? Yeah? It's almost lunchtime. It's the 7th inning stretch of an amazing 2-day conference. I recognize that we've all been through a lot in the last couple of days, a lot of words, a lot of thoughts, a lot of sitting. I'm going to be talking to you recognition that I have a body, that I'm a walking, talking, hallucinating machine that is generating this reality immediately before me, and that all of you are walking, talking, hallucinating bodies, generating your own independent nodes of consciousness, semi-independent nodes of consciousness in this room. I'm going to be talking about the deep questions of psychedelic research, or what I think are deep questions around the nature of the psychedelic mystical experience. And I'd like to start with a quick survey of the audience. Thinking back on your own experiences, quick survey, who here in the room has personally had or has talked with a friend, colleague, somebody in their family, someone they know, about a really profound, spiritual, intense psychedelic experience? Raise your hands. Look around the room, left and right. It's nearly unanimous. Okay. So before we begin, I'd like for you to conjure that experience. In order to do that, I'm going to ask you, in recognition of your body, to close your eyes. Find a comfortable seated position on the chair. And begin to notice where the breath is coming into your body. And just move the breath a little lower and deeper into the diaphragm, into the big Buddha belly. This is something we do in our MDMA trials, diaphragmatic breathing, to help participants get in contact with their bodies before they have profound experiences. So keep breathing deeply. Any tension that you see in your body, just open that up with a breath. And then on the exhale, we can release that tension. And on the next inhalation, we're going to inhale deeply, hold the breath, suspend the breath at the top, hold it, and now exhale broadly. We'll do that 3 more times. Inhale, hold the breath, suspend the breath at the top, and exhale. Deeply inhale. And exhale. One more. Reach from the bottom. Inhale. Hold. And now, keeping your eyes closed, imagine that experience that you may have had with a psychedelic or that one of your friends or colleagues spoke to you about. Recall it richly, deeply. Do you feel it in your body, in your blood, in your psyche? Do you remember the sense of what it was like to see or feel or experience that? We're going to sit in quiet for just the next 25, 30 seconds. I invite you to imagine that, recall that, travel in time back to that moment as deeply as possible as you can generate. Okay. Were you able to recall some fraction of that moment? So today I'm going to be talking about this. We have all these amazing clinical results. I'm a psychologist, I'm interested in clinical healing, but I'm curious and I want to ask you to interrogate this question for me, like what's in this box? People have psychedelic experiences, they have a black box experience, something goes on, a series of things happen, and they have these fantastical high effect size symptom reductions. And we are observers of that process as clinicians, as scientists, as the audience. I call this the mystical black box. I've been talking with my friend and colleague Jeffrey Gus about it. And this is the way that we usually talk about the mechanism of action or the primary mediator is through the mystical experience questionnaire. The idea is that people are given a psychedelic substance and their scores, their complete scores on a measure of mystical experience predict the reductions that we see in anxiety and depression, and this is being offered as the primary or leading explanation as to why psychedelic psychotherapy works, and of course in addition to some of the psychotherapy. So my talk is called The Psychedelic Mystical Experience. I have received a number of different grants and funding sources and consultations in the last 3 years. The talk today will be slightly controversial. Of mysticism, it is said, it begins in mist and ends in a schism. I offer a series of loving critiques today, not to knock the amazing research that's happened with the MEQ. I just think it may be insufficient to study the nature of the reality that we're experiencing. 2 broad questions and 2 studies to go with them. First, are psychedelic mystical experiences genuine? Are they real? Are they as authentic as spiritual and mystical experiences that are not occasioned by psychedelics? You know, Roland Griffiths and team originally called these mystical type experiences because we weren't sure if we wanted to actually say they were mystical. And now we've moved and saying they're mystical experiences, it's okay. The second question that I'm going to ask is what is the nature of the mystical experience with psychedelics? What happens in the black box? The first study is a survey of religious, spiritual, and mystical experiences, RSMEs. This is with my colleagues David Yadin at the University of Pennsylvania and also Ralph Hood, who's the author of the Hood Mysticism Scale, probably the leading scale of mysticism in the theological literature, and Andy Newberg, the noted neurotheologist. The second study draws from in-depth interviews that I have conducted with patients in our psilocybin cancer trial at NYU, a phenomenology trial there, and then a study that we put out about the cancer experience of these patients, and a little bit anecdotally from our religious professional study, although I'll be focusing on the cancer trial. Some big ideas, and today's work is about hypothesis generating and theory development. We're doing a lot of measures and experimental findings. I want to focus on what is the theoretical underpinning. So W.T. Stace talks about the principle of causal indifference. I'll get into that in a minute. William James, father of psychology, offers an empiricist criterion to evaluate and judge the psychedelic mystical experience. And then we generally in the psychedelic literature use the MEQ to measure this. But the MEQ measures a type, one type of mysticism, monistic mysticism, that's consistent with Aldous Huxley and the perennial philosophy, also deism, certain interpretations of Dvaita Vedanta, but may not be consistent with other types of mystical or spiritual experiences. And like I said, I offer 4 critiques, loving critiques, of the idea that there's a single mediator. I imagine there's probably multiple mediators. A theistic critique, a critique out of nature mysticism or shamanism, a critique out of criticalist, queer, and feminist literature. As a queer person, I offer that. And then a methodological critique about the measure development process itself. In the first study, this is the survey, we're looking at 2 questions. So Walter Stace was a professor of philosophy at Princeton. In the 60s, people were saying, these drug users, they're taking LSD, they're saying they're having mystical experiences, but these are not genuine, these are not real, these are not authentic, God-given experiences. These are just drugs in the mind. And Stace offers something called the principle of causal indifference. We will be indifferent to the causes of the experience. So if you have a psychedelic experience and you talk about it, and you have a psychedelic experience and describe it, and you use your phenomenology to describe your psychedelic experience, how am I to judge the real mystic? Will the real mystic please stand up? And And if we just use your phenomenology, your description, your description, your description, it doesn't matter if yours came after 20 years of sitting on the mat in a zendo. It doesn't matter if yours came out of a Sufi zikr circle or that yours came out of 200 micrograms of LSD. He says that all of these are equally valid inducers and that attainment to mystical consciousness by swallowing a pill is possible. This, of course, ticks off the theologians who've been at it their entire lives. William James, earlier in 1902, in a series of lectures, offers a different frame for evaluating mystical experiences. He's a well-known user of nitrous oxide, which he called the anesthetic revelation. And he's considered the father of psychology. He was responding to critics not at the time about psychedelic drugs, but rather to ascetic practices in the theological literature. So he's studying the lives of saints. And some of these saints were real crazy people. They were ascetics. They didn't eat for weeks on end, even Christian saints. They prayed on a cold floor every morning for hours and hours. Or some of them would wander the countryside with their disciples in potato sackcloth, and the cloth would become infested with biting flies, morbidity experiences on their body, biting insects. And the disciples would say, "Please, Master, let me take your potato cloth and hold it against the hot fire to drive the biting insects out." And the mystical sage would say, "No, no, no, this is an experience of God." And William James's audience was scandalized. They were like, this is demonic experience. This is not God-given experience. James admonishes his audience. He says, "You must be ready now to judge the religious life by its results exclusively, and I shall assume that the bugaboo of morbid origin will scandalize your piety no more." So when asked, how are we to judge mystical experience, James says, I'm going to offer an empiricist criterion in the pragmatic tradition. By their fruits ye shall know them, not by their roots. What he means by that is that we are to judge the religious life by the vital experience of the person who claims to have the mystical experience. So here's a survey of 739 participants. It was hosted through the University of Pennsylvania. And basically, we had two groups out of the 739. All of these people claim to have a profound religious, spiritual, or mystical experience. Luckily, about half the sample, this half of the room, your experience was occasioned by a psychedelic drug. This half of the room, you had a spontaneously occurring religious, spiritual, or mystical experience through some other means. It could have been prayer, fasting, meditation, a car crash, we're not quite sure. And then we were able to compare the means between groups to answer Stace's hypothesis and William James's hypothesis. We included a number of demographic controls. We measured the intensity of their mystical experience using the Hood mysticism scale, which is based on the work of Stace, and it's very similar to the MEQ, which we're using in the psychedelic discourse. And then we also measured the fruits, the RSME impact, which is measures of the person's report about the importance of their family, reduced fear of death in their life, an increased sense of health in their life, their reported sense of purpose after this experience, the degree of their religiosity and spirituality. Now the results, I'll just quickly present this. We studied all of these in the psychedelic group versus the non-psychedelic group. And what we find is that, just to go back, we were hoping, or hypothesizing at least, that these would be equivalent experiences, that we weren't really sure what was going to happen, but we were certainly hoping that the psychedelic experience might not be of lesser psychospiritual value according to these scales, but we were curious and we were thinking maybe they'd be equivalent. And largely they were equivalent, but we did have some significant findings. The psychedelic group, this half of the room, had much higher scores on Hood's scale of the mystical experience than the non-psychedelic drug-using group. And in terms of James's question about the fruits of the experience, the people who had a religious or spiritual experience occasioned by psychedelics had significantly higher scores in terms of reduced fear of death, a greater sense of purpose, and increased spirituality as compared to the other group, and a greater overall composite score. So on the whole, these align fairly closely, which suggests that these types of experiences may not be that significantly different, and we weren't able to control for the intensity of the drug experience, which may actually norm this out. But our biggest finding is that on the Hood mysticism scale, the mysticism score is higher in the yellow-orange line, which is the psychedelic group, versus the slightly lower scores in the non-psychedelic group. So this was a test of these two principles. We conclude that perhaps not all mystical experiences are equivalent. This is obviously a very preliminary trial, but it's very difficult to induce spontaneous mystical experiences in the lab. We do that with psychedelics quite frequently, but it's difficult to do for other types of experience and test empirically in that way. I turn now to the second question. What's in the black box? What is the nature of the psychedelic mystical experience? So in the second study, instead of presenting it traditionally, I'm going to offer some evidence from the qualitative interviews through a series of critiques. The qualitative studies are hypothesis generating. Empirical quantitative studies, the majority of what you find in the published literature, are hypothesis testing. They're good for mature disciplines. I think that psychedelic science is actually in its adolescence at best. Maybe we're a tween in the science field. We really have not a very good sense of what exactly is going on. It's a time for hypothesis generating and theory building from the experiences in this field itself. Like I said, I'm drawing from 3 different papers that are, one of which is forthcoming. These are the gratuitous photos of our old room in New York. There's Jeff. There's the medicine. And there it is for the participant. So I interviewed 13 people in the first study. These are fairly white and highly educated individuals. All of these patients had cancer in various stages. The cancer type was breast, lymphoma, ovarian, and a number of other types. So I conducted about an hour and a half to 2 hour long interviews. We transcribed these interviews. We interpreted them rigorously using something called interpretative phenomenological analysis, which draws from the tradition of phenomenology, hermeneutics, and ideography. We had a pretty big team of people. We used Atlas TI, which is a great software program if any of you ever do this. And to maximize the analytic rigor of our findings, we had multiple independent interpreters, multiple independent raters, and then readers for each of the transcripts to maximize cross-check validity. So traditionally, I present the themes that emerged from this data. The paper is available online, was published recently. You can go ahead and read the paper. But first, I'm going to offer these critiques: the theistic, the nature, the criticalist, and the methodological critiques with some supporting evidence. I'm re-engaging with old questions. Most of the literature around this sort of thing goes back to the 60s and 70s. In 1975, Professor Horn wrote, "Since the late 19th century, studies of mysticism have presented us with 2 contrasting conclusions. The first is that mystics all over the world report basically the same experience. And the second is that there are great differences among the reports and possibly among the experiences." What are we to do with this? Zahner, one of perhaps the most famous theologian in this area, says, "We have been told ad nauseum that mysticism is the highest expression of religion and that it appears in all ages and in all places in a more or less identical form. It has become a platitude to observe that mysticism is essentially one and the same. Rarely is any attempt made to substantiate the assumption, and rarely are the equally significant differences analyzed." I'm interested in the differences, and I hope that you might be with me. There are significant differences historically in the psychedelic literature, and the most famous study in the last 15 years is out of Hopkins in 2006, but I'm comparing it to a much earlier series of trials with Masters and Houston, who wrote The Varieties, A Psychedelic Experience, a fantastic book, came out in '66 with LSD. And they treated over 200 subjects, 206, but according to their rubric, only 5%, only 11 subjects, it's 5%, reached an authentic mystical state of the integral level, according to Masters and Houston. In contrast, in Griffith's study at Hopkins, they said that 61% with psilocybin of the volunteers had, quote, a complete mystical experience based on a score of greater than 0.6 in all domains. So I don't know if we're doing it 12 times better, but there's a widely differing experience here about what constitutes a complete mystical experience. And I will say that this has been somewhat abandoned in the last 10 years because we now use the MEQ, not using this 0.6 criterion cutoff, but still the idea sort of holds, and it raises more questions than it answers. So the mystical experience questionnaire is dominant in the field. It is seen as the single mediator hypothesis. This is the measure of choice. It's derived directly from the work of Stace. It does not derive from psychedelic experiences at all. It's derived from Stace's study historically of Christian saints and then saints in the East, in India primarily, which is fine, except that you're taking something from a different field entirely and then applying it to our clinical practice. The MEQ30 is a fantastic measure. I don't mean to knock it. I think it absolutely is a mediator. There's been some fantastic scholarship on it. I'm wholly in praise of this measure. It's been psychometrically validated in both online and survey samples and experimental laboratory samples with psilocybin. Barrett, Johnson, and Griffiths have done some fantastic work on this. I refer you to their work. And it's the primary choice of measure in the cancer studies, including my own co-published work with Dr. Stephen Ross and Jeffrey Gus, Tony Bossis. Also tobacco addiction studies, alcoholism, and with healthy normal volunteers. It is certainly a real mediator of clinical outcome in all of these trials, but I don't think it's the only one. It is not sufficient to our causes. And there's a historical reason for this. Has anyone here ever written a research protocol for any trial? Yeah, it's completely exhausting, right? It's like the worst thing in the world. It's like 80,000 pages long. You're dealing with a lot of people. You have to please everybody. You have to select measures. And the thing when you select measures, you just want to pick the measures that you know will work and you hope will generate some significant findings. And the MEQ has been that measure historically. So Stace generates the characteristics of mystical experience. Pankey at Harvard does the Marsh Chapel experience. He uses this measure. He works with Bill Richards, whom I adore. They develop the MEQ together. Bill Richards goes to Baltimore. It gets used in the Hopkins studies, and then that measure gets disseminated to all of our trials, including our own work at NYU. Now, Pankey said that there were 6 qualities to the mystical experience, 6 characteristics. This later gets boiled down to 4 in a factor analysis on the right. But initially, Pankey and Richards in their scale, and then from Stace's work said, a mystical experience must be one of unity, noetic quality, sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, a transcendence of time and space, ineffability and paradoxicality. The first 3 get boiled down into just what we call the mystical factor and a factor analysis later on, some fantastic work. And here you see that factor analysis with the corresponding items, the mystical factor, the positive mood, the something's going on with space-time, and ineffability. And here you see the MEQ as a mediator. That's the general model that you see in a variety of studies. I'll offer first a theistic critique. Okay, so Stace is a purist. He's a monist. He says a genuine mystical experience is non-sensuous. There's no body involved. It is formless, shapeless, colorless, odorless, soundless, and non-intellectual. And I want you to recall what we did at the beginning, your own experience or the experience you heard about of the psychedelic experience. I don't know if it fits these qualities. For Stace, visions, voices, God encounters, bodhisattva encounters, ancestors, spirit guides, trance states, such as experienced by Ramakrishna, these are not mystical phenomena. These are less privileged phenomenon. Stace said it's not any sort of hocus pocus, such as, quote, mystery mongering. So Stace did not honor the beginning or intermediate states, we might see them that way, that people experience along the path to a full mystical experience. And he privileges monism above all others. He rejects theistic mysticism. This is the reverse of Evelyn Underhill. I don't know, is anyone familiar with Underhill's work? She wrote this amazing tome called Mysticism. She's a woman scholar of mysticism, one of the few in the early parts of the 20th century. And she privileges theistic over monism. She says, like, an experience of the void is not the same thing as having an encounter with God. And many of the women mystics, such as Teresa de Avila, have these profound experiences of God in a very sensuous way that are not accounted for in the MEQ or that are not accounted for under Stace's theory. So the MEQ is designed to measure monism or oneness, the void, mystical quality without characteristics. It's consistent with Advaita Vedanta, forms of non-dualism, and Huxley. But the MEQ does not measure theistic factors. There's not really items regarding God's love, bodhisattva, bhakti. It doesn't measure visions, voices, or spirits. It doesn't measure nature mysticism. It doesn't measure mystery. It doesn't measure relationships, the relationships that people have to their loved ones in psychedelic experience, or seeing their loved ones as conduits of higher love. The MEQ does not measure the soma, the body, our physiological experiences of the ego. This is a supporting quotation from a cancer patient in our trial. I'll just let you read that for a moment. So this person had an experience where she said she was bathed in God's love. And she's not even a self-identified Christian. That person may have scored somewhat highly on the MEQ, which will be correlated with theistic experience, but was not designed to actually measure theistic experience. I offer a nature mysticism critique. I'm aware that we're in a room primarily of white, privileged, wealthy people in the developed world. I'm a white cisgender man. But I have been studying nature mysticism scholarship and shamanic voices and accounts, and I think that they should be brought to bear. So I speak from this position with some humility. This is a painting by the Amazonian artist, now deceased, Pablo Amaringo, of his ayahuasca visions. These are sensuous, right? They're colorful. They have light, color, sound, feeling. I'll just read this. Stace says, only fully developed mystical experiences are necessarily apprehensive of the one. All these other cases that involve sensuous or intellectual or verbal experiences, these are borderline cases, according to Stace. I'm interested in the borderline cases. It's difficult to graft onto psychedelic experience, onto the MEQ, all these various shamanic accounts. These are inconsistent with Stace's criteria. They have form, they have shape, they have color, odor, and they certainly have sound in the Icaros. They involve encounters with the three worlds, the upper realm, the lower realm, the earthbound realm, encounters with the ancestors and Bawiti rituals with Ibogaine, encounters with animal spirits. We have encounters with alien entities or other entities in the DMT experiences. These experiences are seen differently, right? Mendel Kahlen's work shows that music and the coherence and resonance of the patient with music is probably a significant mediator of the experience, as we see with Icaros, for example, in ayahuasca music ceremonies. Maria Sabina's visions of the mushrooms as little children, and her visions, if you read them, don't really accord very well with a quality-less mystical experience. And this draws from Halifax, Jeremy Narby, and Michael Harner's accounts, my teacher at Cambridge, who recently died, accounts of shamanism, and specifically Amazonian shamanism. Today, with other white, primarily white individual patients with cancer in New York City, this is what they described, right? We're on First Avenue in Manhattan, right? It's cars and taxi cabs, not a lot of sky. But the people saw a gorilla face, a horse's eye, mystifying two serpents coming together, two colored cow heads. One individual had a vision of a blue, placid lake, white mountains in the distance, with a boatman who came to greet her, wearing a white hat on the sandy shore, and he became her psychopomp in the experience. We have people soaring through gaudy cathedrals. We have individuals traveling on roller coasters through valleys. We had people with three-dimensional chessboards. A priest I recently spoke to had an experience of God through like a robot consciousness, AI. Some very queer and weird things are happening. There's also, in our qualitative studies, we find many instances of synesthesia, body, somatic experiences, visual auditory synesthesia, somatic auditory, gustatory auditory. People are feeling cloud vapor on their body, like in the experience, even though there's no clouds in the study room, for example. We also have encounters with guiding spirits, spirit guides, psychopomps, guiding angels, They often provide guidance and reassurance. We also have body experiences, right? Like, we all have bodies. We're hallucinating machines. So these somatic experiences are important, especially in a cancer trial where people are suffering from surgery, chemotherapy, recovering from these like profound physical traumas to the body. And we had patients talk about the ejection of a black mass from their torso. We have people talk about mushroom cloud explosions where they eject fear of cancer or the idea of the sort of like the harm of cancer in their body. We had one participant who was able to shake his fingers and cancer drained out of his body through his fingertips, leading to acceptances of the cancer in the body and a new acceptance and reaffirmation of the human soma, of their bodies. One person was able to see in a vision vestigial lumps of the cancer tumor, and he would check them over and over and over again, but he saw them now as benign, as clear and harmless tissue, tumors no more. This person, Edna, says, my fear just coalesced and I mentally saw it. It was right there. It was a big black thing right there under my rib cage. My fear was there, and I was just overcome with anger and rage that this thing was fucking me up. And I screamed, get the fuck out! Just get out! I ejected the fear, and it was gone. The fear was gone. I'd also like to offer a critique from a criticalist, queer, or feminist. This is a very early preliminary series of thoughts, so I invite you to help me think through this. There's a lot of words on this page, but I think it's important to go through them. Female mysticism is strongly associated, at least within Christianity and the Christian tradition, with voices, with visionary experiences, with pain, with suffering, with ecstasies, with creative expression, spiritual longing and devotion, love, friendship. The experience is not the lone meditator on the mountaintop and on the peak in an empty vista of nothing. The experience is about love and care of people in relationship, in community, and in circle with one another, and caring relationships with mothers and fathers, with daughters and sons, with infants and grandparents. Wright and Heron argue that mystical treatments which deny these experiences or say that these are borderline cases are fundamentally androcentric, patriarchal, and misogynist. Relational mysticism, the experience of the real, for lack of a better word, in relationships with others, not separate from them, has been generally neglected in mystical scholarship. There are ideas of interpersonal connectedness out of the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. We also see this across multiple traditions in the Sufist, Christian, Buddhist, Tantric, Guru, Karma Yoga, and the radical queer traditions of which I'm a part. One of my teachers at NYU, Carol Gilligan, makes a feminist critique in a similar vein of moral theory development. So Kohlberg had these ideas of moral theory of pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality, the highest form of moral development of an individual. And he consistently found that his male students would score higher in their moral development than his female students. And Carol Gilligan said, no. She started interviewing women, and she learned from the women that they were having experiences around an ethic of compassion and an ethic of care. And that the male students were more interested in a justice-oriented morality. The women students tended to be more interested in an ethic of care, but that if we revise the measure, we don't have this disparity between men and women, which is primarily androcentric. I think that attachment theory, anyone who studied the attachment disorders, right, know that these are profoundly important in clinical work. They've largely been ignored or not studied as moderators or mediators of the psychedelic experience in our clinical science work. And finally, one of my teachers, Donna Dreyer, with Richard Jensen, talks about the clinical implications of touch. You know, we're allowed to hold a patient's hand or maybe to touch their shoulder. But we aren't really allowed in many protocols to do any other forms of embrace, of deep embrace, of holding of our patients. And the denial of the body is in a way like part of the queer feminist discourse critique of a masculine-centered way of understanding our bodies. We're not just intellectual experiences, right? We're like deeply held affective experiences with our own attachment disorders and repairs that are possible. And so Donna Dreyer asks, what's it like to take a profound psychedelic and have yourself be held, hugged, and cradled in the arms of your therapist or of a co-voyager. In our cancer trial, the father or mother almost always appeared in the person's visions. In more than half of the visions, the mom or dad appeared. Romantic partners and children were also very common visional experiences. People moved from anger and disappointment in their relationships with other human people in their life to acceptance and forgiveness. These were often seen as profound and visionary or mystical experiences, right? It's not just a psychotherapeutic experience. There's like a vision of the person and then some sort of profound reclamation of the relationship. For Victor, my dad, the spirit guide, took the form of my dad. My dad came in and was like, things are going to be okay. Don't worry, everything is going to be okay. That was very reassuring to me. So frequently people appeared as guiding spirits in people's lives, and human relationships were important throughout these trials. Lastly, I'll offer a methodological critique. Steve Ross is going to present some of the findings from our cancer trial, so I'm not going to go over this in depth, but we certainly find in the NYU study that the MEQ is a substantial and important mediator of the experience. In our sister site in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, they also found that the MEQ predicted with cancer patients significant reductions in anxiety and depression. This is the sort of scatter plot of that. But when you look at the strength of that mediation, these are R values on the plot itself, R values of 0.59 and R values of 0.36. You have to square those to get to R squared. And what we find is that for anxiety, 35% of the improvements we see in anxiety are explained by the mystical experience questionnaire, by the MEQ, whether the person had a mystical experience. But that means that 65% of the variability in their anxiety symptoms are explained by other causes. And that 35% that is explained by the MEQ is probably highly correlated with different subtypes of mysticism or other types of mysticism. For depression, we only see in the Hopkins trial 13% of the variability in their depression scores is explained by the MEQ, by the mystical experience questionnaire, meaning that 83% of the phenomena is not explained. The black box, there's a lot going on in that black box, and it's not one mediator. The problem has been that traditionally the measures that we employ are etic, that means top-down, rather than emic, which means bottom-up. So top-down measures are you take something like the MEQ, which was developed from theological discourse and then cross-applied to psychedelic research. And many of these items, including the Challenging Experiences Questionnaire, which is an interesting and fantastic measure, the Oceanic Bandlessness Questionnaire, the Dread of Ego Dissolution, and the Acceptance and Action Questionnaire, originate in other fields in psychotherapy literature, but were not really designed from the experience of psychedelic medicine. Ideally, I think we've been doing it backwards. Ideally, what we would do is do an emic, bottom-up approach. We would interview patients, as we've been doing in a number of trials. We would gather together and generate hundreds of questions, 200, 300 questions from patient phenomenological reports to address things like human relationships, physical experiences, vision experiences. We create an item test bank. We'd validate those in online surveys and see which ones loaded with each other's, which one were predictive. We would validate those items in clinical data with our psilocybin and other trials. We would run an exploratory factor analysis and then develop a measure and a confirmatory factor analysis and test it out. That measure would actually be derived from the psychedelic experience, where we're doing the home of our work, not for some other field that we're trying to apply and just see if it fits. It's usually going to be a misfit. So let's peer inside the black box to develop our theory better and to understand the mechanisms of action. The measure development has been done backwards. A single mediator is likely insufficient as a hypothesis. Multiple mediators are more likely. The MEQ30 does not articulate or really was designed to measure other types of mystical experience. It's rooted in a monomystical tradition of Stace. And the interviews that we do and the clinical anecdotes that many people who work in this field share don't fit very well and suggest a much more rich and complex topography. There's other possible critiques I'm not going to offer today. I think that we privilege in America the psychedelic experience over psycholytic experiences, which is a tradition in Europe, which are like lower dose experiences, which also involve psychotherapeutic processes, not just in the integration or sessions, for example, but psychotherapeutic processes that happen with the medicine, right? And then Terence McKenna just says, psychedelic experience is weird. It's really weird, right? Like, and it's not just ineffable. It is, we can talk about it, but it's very bizarre and strange. And there may be other things we don't even really understand yet. So I've asked two questions. What is the nature of this experience? And I'm revising my question to ask, what are the natures of psychedelic mystical experience? We measure monistic mysticism, but we really don't measure theism, nature mysticism, or shamanism, the dark night of the soul, or like difficult or challenging experiences, which I have a whole other part of my paper about, relational mysticism, communication with spirit guides, spiritual awakening. I'm a yoga teacher in a different life. The somatic, kundalini, and bioenergetic processes are very difficult to measure. That doesn't mean that they're not playing some role. And we should be developing measures which are emic and grounded in the psychedelic experience, not grafted on from another field. To conclude, what should we do in the future? Mysticism is many. I don't think it is one. We can debate that, but we should at least pay attention and try to measure the multiple varieties of it. We should not privilege monistic mysticism in our methods. On the methodological column, we should systematically test to see if women, racial minorities, sexual and gender minorities score differently on these questionnaires. We have not systematically done that. We have not systematically studied these mediators in subgroup analyses. That should be standard operating procedure. It is not. We should include measures and tests for theistic and other mystical experience and develop measures from the ground up. I've already asked these questions, but there's a number of implications for our practice. So I have a number of references. And in closing, I would just like to thank you all for being hallucinating physical somatic machines in this room with me. You all conjured your psychedelic or near psychedelic experiences at the beginning of this lecture. And I think it's important if we're going to study these with a modicum of grace, humility, and intelligence, to bring our skills and intelligence to it, we need to think deeply and critically. We've let some history and a variety of power structures constrain our thinking and our measures, and I think that that does not need to be the case. And I encourage us to open our thinking about these processes. Thank you.